I was working the morning shift at Starbucks, the kind of shift where you don't have a single second to breathe. It was a Tuesday. I remember that much because Tuesdays were always chaos. People dragging themselves in, half awake, desperate for caffeine before heading to work. I'd been working there for about 8 months, and by then, I'd seen my fair share of rude customers. The ones who sighed dramatically if their order took longer than 30 seconds, the ones who refused to say thank you, and the ones who thought their coffee preferences were a life-or-death matter. But this guy? He was something else. From the second he stepped into the store, he had this air about him, tense, restless, like he was waiting for an excuse to snap. I noticed him while making drinks at the bar. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, wearing a wrinkled button-up and jeans that looked a little too clean, like he'd just bought them. He ordered a venti caramel macchiato, nothing complicated, but the way he spoke, short, clipped sentences, set me on edge. "Make it hot," he said, his voice sharp, like he was challenging me. I nodded, did my usual routine, but I could feel his eyes burning into me the whole time. I thought maybe he was just in a bad mood, but something about the way he stood, hands twitching at his sides, made my stomach tighten. When I placed his drink on the counter, he didn't move right away. Just stood there, staring at it. The store was packed, people coming in and out, the espresso machines whirring, orders being called. But for some reason, in that moment, everything felt too quiet. Finally, he picked up the cup, lifted it an inch, then slammed it back down so hard that caramel foam splashed out of the lid. I barely had time to process what was happening before he started screaming. It wasn't the usual kind of angry yelling. No demands for a refund, no complaints about the order. It was incoherent, raw, like his words were just noise, filled with rage. He knocked over the drink stand first, sending packets of sugar and stirrers flying. Then he grabbed a chair and hurled it across the room, where it crashed against the wall. People gasped. A woman near the door let out a shriek. I froze, my hands gripping the counter, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My manager, Rachel, rushed out from the back, her face pale but set in that forced calm expression she always used when dealing with difficult customers. "Sir, you need to calm down," she said, keeping her voice even, like she was talking to a wild animal. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he grabbed another chair, this time swinging it like he was about to throw it at the counter. I heard someone in the crowd mutter, "Jesus Christ," while another customer darted for the exit. Rachel reached for her phone, probably to call security, but before she could dial, the guy did something that made my stomach drop. He climbed onto the counter, just jumped up like it was the most natural thing in the world. His shoes landed inches from the espresso machine, and for a second no one moved. His head tilted slightly, and that's when I saw it. The smile. Wide, unnatural, stretched too far across his face, like his skin barely fit his skull. His eyes darted around, taking us all in, but it was like he wasn't really looking at us. More like he was waiting. I took a shaky step back, my brain scrambling for what to do. My co-workers were frozen too. Jake, who had been taking orders, had a look of pure panic on his face, and Olivia, who was steaming milk, was gripping the pitcher so tight her knuckles were white. Rachel managed to say something into her phone, her voice sharp and urgent, but it felt like it didn't matter anymore. Whatever this guy was doing, it had gone beyond a simple outburst. Then, as if on cue, he stopped moving completely. His breathing slowed, his body stiffened, and for a few agonizing seconds, he didn't even blink. Just stood there still grinning, like a mannequin that had been wound up too tight. And then, without warning, he leaned forward, bending at an impossible angle, staring straight down at me. His face was so close I could see the veins pulsing in his forehead, his pupils blown so wide they swallowed the color of his irises. In a low, rasping whisper, he said, "You're not real." I felt my entire body go cold. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them, like he truly believed it. Like I was the one who didn't belong here. My breath hitched, and for a second I thought I was going to pass out. Rachel was still on the phone, her voice tense, but the guy didn't seem to notice anymore. He just kept staring, that awful grin locked in place. The customers who hadn't already run out were pressed against the walls, watching in horrified silence. No one knew what to do. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. His entire body twitched, like a marionette whose strings had been cut. He blinked rapidly, confusion flickering across his face. His breathing was ragged now, his posture slack, as if whatever had taken over him had just let go. Without a word, he hopped off the counter, landed unsteadily on his feet, and walked straight to the door. He didn't run, didn't make a scene. He just left. We stood there for what felt like forever, waiting for something, anything, to happen next. The second the door swung shut behind him, Rachel exhaled sharply, her fingers shaking as she ended the call. "Cops are on the way," she murmured, but I barely heard her. My head was still spinning. I looked over at Jake and Olivia. They both looked just as shaken as I felt. It was like we had all just walked away from something we weren't meant to see. The police showed up minutes later, took our statements, checked the security footage. They asked if we'd seen the guy before, if we knew his name. None of us had. They promised to look into it, but I never heard anything after that. No follow-up, no explanation. He was just gone. I still think about that day sometimes, about the way he looked at me. I don't know what happened to him, or what he meant when he whispered those words to me. But the scariest part? I don't think I want to know. I was 22 when it happened. Back then, I was working the late shift at a Starbucks just off the highway, one of those locations that never really felt safe after dark. I'd taken the job to help cover rent while I finished my last semester of college, and most nights I was the last one out, locking up after the closing manager left. It wasn't unusual for the parking lot to be completely deserted by the time I got to my car. Just rows of empty spaces, lit by flickering streetlights, with nothing but the hum of passing cars in the distance. That night was supposed to be just like any other. I remember the way the cold air hit me as I stepped outside. It had been raining earlier, and the pavement was still slick, reflecting the neon glow of the Starbucks sign. My car, an old Honda Civic, was parked just a few spaces away. I pulled my keys from my apron pocket, balancing my phone and my nearly empty cup of coffee in my other hand. The moment I pressed the unlock button, I heard it. Fast footsteps, closing in on me from behind. Not casual steps, not the shuffle of someone walking to their own car. These were urgent, deliberate. Someone was running straight at me. Before I could even turn around, an arm wrapped around my waist, yanking me backward so hard I dropped everything. My phone clattered against the pavement. My keys skidded under the car next to mine. I gasped, trying to scream, but a hand clamped over my mouth, muffling the sound. The next thing I knew, I was being shoved into the passenger seat of my own car. The door slammed shut beside me, and a man, tall, wearing a dark hoodie, scrambled into the driver's seat. I was too stunned to move at first, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. I reached for the door handle, but before I could pull it, he grabbed my wrist, squeezing so hard I thought my bones would snap. "Don't," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational, like this was normal for him. The car was already moving, peeling out of the parking lot with a screech of tires. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I wanted to fight, to scream, but my body was frozen, locked in pure panic. The only thing I could do was watch as the Starbucks sign disappeared in the rearview mirror, taking any chance of help with it. We sped down the highway, the dashboard lights casting a dull glow over his face. I tried to get a better look at him, but his hood was pulled low, shadowing most of his features. The only thing I could make out was his jaw, sharp, clenched, and the way his hands gripped the steering wheel like he was forcing himself to stay in control. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, my brain flicking between every survival tip I'd ever heard. Stay calm. Look for an escape. Memorize details. But my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them still in my lap. We took an exit I didn't recognize, the car weaving through dark, empty streets. My stomach lurched when I realized he wasn't talking. No threats, no demands, nothing. Just silence, except for the hum of the tires against the wet pavement. That silence scared me more than anything. If he wasn't saying anything, what was he planning to do? I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. His grip on the wheel tightened. I needed to do something. I thought about jerking the steering wheel, but at the speed we were going, I'd probably just kill us both. My best chance was when we stopped. I glanced down. My purse was still on the floorboard by my feet, half open from when I'd dropped it. My fingers twitched, itching to reach inside for anything I could use as a weapon. But before I could move, he slammed on the brakes. My body lurched forward, stopped only by the seatbelt locking across my chest. We were in a deserted lot, nothing but an old warehouse in the distance. No streetlights, no houses, just us. For the first time, he turned to look at me. Even in the dark, I could see his eyes, cold, calculating. He reached into his hoodie pocket and I flinched, expecting a knife, a gun, something. Instead, he pulled out my phone. My stomach twisted as he held it up, the lock screen glowing between us. "Who should I call?" he asked, his voice eerily casual. I didn't understand at first. Then it hit me. He was about to make someone believe I was fine, that I was safe, that I wasn't sitting in the passenger seat of my own car, trapped with a man who hadn't even told me his name. I felt my throat tighten as I stared at my phone in his hand. My mind raced through every possible response. If I refused to answer, he might hurt me. If I picked the wrong person, he might realize I was trying to send a signal. I had to think fast. I licked my lips, forcing my voice to stay steady. "My roommate," I said. "She's probably waiting up for me." That wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. He stared at me for a long moment, then tapped the screen. My heart pounded as the call connected. I held my breath, praying she wouldn't pick up. 1 ring, 2. Then her voice, sleepy, confused. "Hello?" I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, he leaned in, pressing a finger against my lips. I froze. "Hey, Rachel," he said smoothly, using my name like he'd known me for years. "I just wanted to let you know I'm staying over at Mike's tonight. Fell asleep watching a movie." My blood ran cold. He was pretending to be me. I could hear her shifting in bed. Okay? You good?" she asked. My stomach twisted. If I could just... He ended the call before I could make a sound. My phone screen dimmed, leaving us in darkness. He exhaled, almost like he was relieved. That should buy us some time. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Buy us some time? What the hell did that mean? I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. He tossed my phone onto the dashboard like it meant nothing, then turned back to the wheel. "You're gonna sit there and be quiet," he said, his voice calm, almost patient, like he was explaining something to a child. "And if you don't, things get messy. Understand?" I didn't trust my voice, so I nodded. My hands were clenched so tight in my lap that my nails dug into my palms. He pulled out of the lot, driving slower this time, like he wasn't in a rush anymore, like he had all the time in the world. I risked another glance around. No cars, no houses, just endless darkness stretching beyond the road. My chances of running were getting smaller by the second. Then, something changed. Up ahead, headlights appeared in the distance. Another car heading toward us. It was the first sign of life I'd seen since he took me. My body tensed. This is it. My only chance. As the car got closer, I made my move. I didn't think. I just acted. I reached down, grabbed my purse from the floor, and in one motion, swung it as hard as I could at his face. The impact caught him off guard. He cursed, his hand slipping on the wheel for just a second. It was all I needed. I threw myself at the door handle, yanking it open. The rush of cold air hit me as I tumbled out, landing hard on the asphalt. My knees scraped against the rough pavement, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, waving my arms wildly at the approaching car, screaming with everything I had. The approaching car slammed on its brakes, tires screeching against the wet road. Headlights flooded over me, blinding for a second, but I didn't care. I kept waving, kept screaming. Behind me, I heard my car door swing open. Heavy footsteps. He was coming after me. My whole body locked up with fear, but I forced myself to move, running straight toward the other vehicle. The driver's door flew open. A man stepped out, middle-aged, stocky, wearing a flannel and jeans. His face twisted in confusion, then alarm as he took in the scene. "Hey, what the hell is going on?" he shouted. I barely had time to answer before my captor grabbed me from behind, yanking me back. I kicked, thrashed, fought with everything I had, but his grip was iron. "Help me!" I screamed, desperation tearing through my throat. The driver's hesitation lasted half a second before he moved. "Let her go now!" he bellowed, storming toward us. My captor hesitated. Just a flicker of uncertainty, but it was enough. He let go, shoved me forward, and bolted back to my car. Before I could even catch my breath, I heard the engine roar to life. The tires screeched as he peeled away, vanishing into the darkness. I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air, my legs trembling too hard to hold me up. The man crouched beside me, his hand hovering near my shoulder, unsure if he should touch me. "You okay?" "Jesus, kid, what the hell just happened?" I could barely get the words out. He took me. That was my car." My voice shook, raw from screaming. The man's face hardened. "We're calling the cops." I was on my way home from work when I stopped at a Starbucks off the highway. It wasn't my usual spot. I had never been to this one before, but I really had to use the bathroom. The place was half empty, that weird lull between the afternoon rush and the evening crowd. A few people sat by the windows, sipping drinks, staring at their laptops. The baristas barely looked up as I walked past the counter toward the restrooms in the back. The bathroom was single-use, clean enough, but nothing special. I locked the door behind me, but as I turned to the sink, something caught my eye. On the metal lock, right where the bolt slid into place, there was a tiny sticker, almost perfectly cut to fit. It was plain, like one of those little price tags, but it was covering something. That was weird. Why would there be a sticker right there? Curiosity got the best of me. I peeled it off, expecting. Honestly, I don't know what I expected. What I didn't expect was to see a small, dark circle underneath it. At first, I thought it was just a hole or a defect in the metal, but when I looked closer, I felt my stomach drop. It was a camera lens. Tiny, barely noticeable unless you were searching for it. My breath caught in my throat, and I immediately turned to scan the rest of the bathroom, my pulse hammering in my ears. The walls were bare. The ceiling vent looked normal. I crouched and checked under the sink. Behind the trash can, nothing. But someone had placed this here. Someone had stuck that sticker over it to hide it. And if they'd done that, it meant they had planned for someone to find it. My skin crawled at the thought. I grabbed my bag, trying to act normal, and unlocked the door, stepping out into the cafe. I walked out as casually as I could, but my hands were shaking. The cafe looked the same as before, calm, normal. Nobody was watching me. Nobody was acting suspicious. I glanced toward the counter where a barista was taking an order, and then to the tables near the windows. People were working on laptops, chatting, scrolling through their phones. Nothing seemed off. But my skin was still crawling. Someone had put that camera there, and they had to be nearby. I forced myself to walk toward the exit, trying not to make it obvious that I was scanning the room. That's when I saw him. A man sitting at a table near the door, alone. He had short, dark hair, and he was wearing a navy hoodie, the hood down but slightly bunched at the back of his neck. His phone was in his hand, angled slightly upward, just high enough that it didn't seem natural. His gaze flickered up for the briefest moment, just long enough for our eyes to meet. My stomach twisted. I kept walking, acting like I hadn't noticed, but my heartbeat pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I reached for my car keys in my bag, trying to steady my breath. As I pushed through the door, I caught one last glimpse of him in my peripheral vision. He wasn't looking at his phone anymore. He was looking at me. I stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting my face like a slap. I needed to get to my car, fast. I kept my pace steady, but my instincts were screaming at me to run. My car was parked just a few rows away. I clicked the unlock button, my fingers stiff from the tension, and yanked the door open. As I slid into the driver's seat, I hesitated, just for a second, before looking back toward the Starbucks entrance. He was standing now, still inside, just past the glass door, his hands in his hoodie pocket. He wasn't looking at me anymore, not directly, but his posture had changed, stiff, alert, like he was waiting for something, or deciding something. My pulse thundered in my ears as I jammed the key into the ignition. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. Something was wrong. As soon as the engine roared to life, I locked the doors. My hands were trembling so badly I nearly fumbled the gear shift, but I forced myself to stay calm. I backed out of the parking spot, keeping my eyes on my mirrors. He hadn't moved. He was still standing there, still watching. But then, just as I turned onto the main road, I saw it. He pulled his phone out again. This time, there was no mistaking it. He was holding it up like he was recording. My throat tightened. I drove faster, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see him following me. But there was nothing. No car pulling out after mine. No dark figure walking through the lot. Still, I didn't stop looking over my shoulder until I was miles away, until the Starbucks was just a bad memory behind me. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd escaped something worse than I understood. I didn't go to the police. What would I even say? There was a hidden camera in the bathroom, and a guy might have been watching me? I had no proof, no way of knowing who put it there, or why. But I knew what I saw. And the worst part? I still wonder if I was the first person to find that camera, or just the first person to notice. I was never the kind of person to get paranoid about strangers. Living in a big city, you learn to keep your head down, mind your business, and not overthink the occasional weird encounter. But this night changed the way I see everything. It was late November, the kind of evening where the cold bites at your skin even through layers. I had just finished a long shift at the office, numbers, spreadsheets, the usual mind-numbing stuff, and I needed something to warm me up before the bus ride home. There was a Starbucks a block from my stop, so I ducked in, ordered a caramel macchiato, and leaned against the counter, waiting. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting at one of the small corner tables, just close enough to the window to catch the city lights. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. Dark coat, messy graying hair, face weathered in a way that suggested he'd seen things. He wasn't drinking anything, no laptop, no book, just sitting there, staring at me, At first I thought I was imagining it, but every time I glanced up, his eyes were on me. Not in a casual way, not like someone absent-mindedly looking around a café. It was direct, deliberate. I felt my stomach tighten. I told myself he was just a harmless guy, maybe a little odd, but nothing to worry about. My coffee was called and I grabbed it quickly, pulling my scarf up around my face as I headed for the door. I walked fast. The bus stop wasn't far, and the sidewalk was busy enough that I wasn't alone. The city noise helped drown out my nerves. I kept my gaze straight ahead, sipping my coffee, trying to shake off the unease. A few minutes passed, and my bus finally pulled up. I exhaled in relief, stepping on and heading toward my usual seat near the middle. As I settled in, I instinctively glanced out the window. My stomach dropped. There he was, standing by the curb, eyes locked on me. He wasn't getting on, just watching. The doors closed and the bus pulled away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. 15 minutes later, I had to transfer to another bus, a normal part of my routine. The first stop was crowded, people shuffling in different directions, some heading into the nearby subway station, others waiting like me. I was starting to calm down, convincing myself that I had just overreacted. I checked my phone, scrolled through some messages, and when I finally glanced up, my breath caught in my throat. He was there, not far, standing just outside the pool of streetlight, half hidden in the shadows. He hadn't been on my bus. He had followed me another way. I wasn't just imagining things. He was watching me. And now I knew for sure. I wasn't going home alone tonight. I felt my fingers tighten around my phone, my pulse hammering in my ears. I needed to act like I hadn't seen him, like I wasn't freaking out. If I let him know I was scared, would that make it worse? I turned slightly, pretending to be focused on my screen, but my mind was racing. Should I call someone? What would I even say? Hey, some guy's been watching me since Starbucks, and now he's here at my bus stop? It sounded paranoid. And yet every instinct in me was screaming that this wasn't normal. The next bus arrived, and people started filing on. I waited until the last possible second to move, hoping he'd stay where he was, that maybe I'd get lucky and he'd lose interest. But as I stepped up onto the bus, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. My stomach twisted. He was coming. He climbed on right behind me, close enough that I could feel his presence like a weight pressing against my back. The driver barely looked up as I dropped my fare into the machine, and I shuffled quickly toward the middle of the bus, gripping the metal pole for balance. The seats were mostly full, so I stayed standing, heart pounding as I watched the man out of the reflection in the window. He didn't sit. He stood near the doors, holding onto a strap, his gaze fixed on me in the reflection. He wasn't pretending to look at something else. He wasn't being subtle. He wanted me to know. I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping my phone so tight I was sure I'd cracked the case. Should I get off at a different stop? Try to lose him? But what if that made it worse? The thought of walking alone, of stepping onto an empty sidewalk with him trailing just behind me, made my skin crawl. I couldn't let that happen. I had to think. The bus ride felt endless. Every stop, I prayed he'd get off, but he didn't. He was waiting for me to reach my final stop. I decided right then, I wasn't walking home alone. I needed a plan, a way to shake him off before I stepped onto the dark, quiet street leading to my apartment. My fingers hovered over my phone screen, but I hesitated. Who would I even call? It was late. Most of my friends weren't nearby, and I wasn't about to call my parents just to panic them. My only option was to outsmart him, or at the very least, not let him get the upper hand. The bus was approaching my stop, and I had seconds to decide. I thought about telling the driver, but what could they really do? I could feel the man's eyes on me, heavy, unblinking. If I got off alone, I had no doubt he'd follow. I needed witnesses. I needed to make it hard for him to do whatever he was planning. At the last second, I made my move. Instead of exiting through the back door like I normally would, I pushed forward, slipping out through the front, right past the driver. There was a small group of people getting off as well, 2 guys in their 20s and an older woman. I stuck close to them, pretending I was part of their conversation. My heart was racing, but I didn't dare look back. If he followed, I'd deal with it. If he didn't, maybe I'd finally breathe again. I walked fast, staying in step with the guys, even laughing under my breath like I was reacting to something they said. I could hear my pulse in my ears, feel the tension in my shoulders. But when I finally stole a glance over my shoulder, the man was still at the bus stop, just standing there, watching. He didn't follow this time. He knew I had made it impossible for him to get me alone. I kept walking, only breaking off from the group when I reached my building. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me with shaking hands. That night I barely slept, replaying every second in my head. Who was he? What did he want? I don't know. But I do know this. If I hadn't trusted my instincts, if I had walked home alone like I always did, he would have followed, and I don't think I'd be here telling this story. I started working at Starbucks when I was 19, fresh out of high school and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. It wasn't a bad gig. Free coffee, decent tips, and a predictable routine. The store was in a relatively quiet part of town, tucked between a nail salon and a bookstore that barely had any customers. Most of our regulars were friendly, the kind of people who tipped well and made small talk about the weather. I knew the faces that came in every morning, the ones who ordered the same drinks without even glancing at the menu. But that afternoon, just past the lunch rush, a new face appeared. A man in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, standing near the register with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tattered gray hoodie. At first, I didn't think much of him. We got all kinds of people wandering in, some just looking to use the bathroom or escape the summer heat. But something about this guy felt off. He wasn't looking at the pastries or the drink options. He wasn't even pretending to be interested in the menu board. He just stood there, shifting from foot to foot, glancing at me every so often like he was waiting for something. I greeted him, asked if he needed any help, but he mumbled something about deciding what he wanted. His voice was raspy, like he had spent years inhaling cigarette smoke. My gut told me to keep an eye on him, but there were customers behind him, so I turned away to grab a drink from the counter. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of metal scraping against glass. My stomach dropped. I spun around just in time to see the guy's hand wrapped around our tip jar, trying to yank it off the counter. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice sharper than I expected. His head snapped up, and for a second we locked eyes. His were bloodshot, sunken deep into his skull, like he hadn't slept in weeks. Then, without a word, he bolted. He shoved past a woman walking in, nearly knocking her over as he sprinted out the door. I rushed around the counter, but by the time I reached the entrance, he was already gone. Just a blur disappearing into the parking lot. The rest of my shift felt surreal, like my body was moving on autopilot while my brain kept replaying what had happened. It wasn't the first time I had seen someone try to steal tips, but the way he looked at me, like I had caught him doing something far worse than just taking a few crumpled bills, made my skin crawl. By the time closing rolled around, I had convinced myself it was over. The guy got spooked, he ran, end of story. So when I locked up and stepped out into the near-empty parking lot, I wasn't thinking about him anymore. Not until I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I froze. The lot was mostly empty, just a few scattered cars under the flickering streetlights. My own car was parked near the back, and I had maybe 20 steps to go. I told myself it was nothing, someone else leaving late, maybe another employee from the strip mall. But the footsteps weren't casual. They were steady, deliberate, closing the distance between us. I forced myself to turn around, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. And there he was, the same man from earlier. Only this time, he wasn't running. He stood just a few yards away, hands still buried in the pockets of his hoodie. In the dim light, I could see the way his lips curled into a half smirk, like this was funny to him. "You scared me back there," he said, his voice just as raspy as before. My stomach twisted. There was no one else around. The bookstore had closed an hour ago, and my manager had left right before me. I was completely alone. I gripped my keys tight in my fist, the way my mom had taught me when I first started driving at night. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. He took a step closer. My pulse skyrocketed. "Neither do I," he murmured, tilting his head slightly. "Just figured we should finish what we started." His words sent a cold spike of fear through me. I didn't know what he meant, but I knew I didn't want to find out. My car was right there. If I made a run for it, maybe I could get inside before he got any closer. My fingers fumbled with my keys, trying to find the right one, but my hands were shaking so badly that I kept missing it. The man let out a small chuckle, like he was enjoying this. Then he moved. Fast. Too fast. He lunged forward and instinct took over. I threw my keys at him hard. They hit his chest with a metallic clatter, and in the split second that he flinched, I bolted. My feet barely touched the pavement as I sprinted to my car, yanking the door open and slamming it shut, just as he reached for me. I jammed the lock down and scrambled to start the engine. My hands were slick with sweat, my breathing ragged. Through the windshield, I saw him standing there inches from the hood of my car, his face twisted in something that was almost amusement. Then, slowly, he raised one hand and tapped his knuckles against my window. The sound was soft, almost polite. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the glass. I couldn't breathe. My fingers fumbled with the ignition, my brain screaming at me to move, but for a split second, I was frozen. He tilted his head, that same eerie smirk creeping back onto his face. "Come on," he said, his voice muffled through the window. "You're not gonna make me walk, are you?" The casualness of it, the way he acted like we were just two friends sharing a joke, made my skin crawl. Finally, my brain snapped back into action. I twisted the key so hard I nearly broke it, and the engine roared to life. The moment I threw the car into reverse, he backed up, raising his hands in mock surrender. My tires screeched against the pavement as I jerked the wheel, nearly clipping the curb in my rush to get the hell out of there. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing exactly where I'd left him, watching me. He didn't chase me. He didn't yell. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, like he had all the time in the world. I didn't stop driving until I reached my apartment, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. I locked my doors, double-checked my windows, but sleep never came that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. The way he looked at me. The way he spoke, like we had unfinished business. The next day, I told my manager what happened. He said he'd checked the security footage, but nothing ever came of it. The guy never came back to the store. No police report, no follow-up. It was like he had just vanished. But sometimes, even now, when I'm walking alone at night, I hear footsteps behind me. And every time, I have to fight the urge to turn around, because deep down, I'm terrified that if I do, I'll see him standing there, smiling like he's been waiting for me all along. I was 23 when this happened, back when I worked the closing shifts at a Starbucks in a quiet suburban town. It wasn't a bad job, slow nights, regulars who knew my name, and the occasional group of students cramming for exams. I actually liked the solitude of closing alone. Something about the hum of the espresso machines winding down and the smell of coffee lingering in the air made me feel at peace. That night, it was just me. My coworker, Amanda, had left about 20 minutes earlier, and I was doing my final sweep, making sure everything was prepped for the morning shift. The only thing left was to take out the trash and lock up. It wasn't until I was wiping down the counters that I noticed him, standing just outside, near the sidewalk, barely illuminated by the dim streetlights. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. No phone, no coffee cup, no cigarette, just staring toward the store, but not exactly at me. I told myself it wasn't unusual. We got our fair share of late-night wanderers, especially in winter when people just wanted to warm up before heading home. Still, something about him felt off. He was too still, too focused, like he was waiting for something. I shook off the unease, finished wiping down the espresso machine, and turned off the open sign. At exactly 10:30, I locked the front doors. I checked them twice out of habit, pulling on the handles to make sure they were secure. The guy was still there, but I ignored him. If he wanted coffee, he was out of luck. We were closed. I turned my back and headed to the storage room to grab a trash bag. That's when I heard it. The soft chime of the front door opening. The same chime I'd heard hundreds of times when customers walked in. My stomach dropped. I knew for a fact that I'd locked that door. Slowly I peeked around the corner, my breath caught in my throat. And there he was, inside. Standing just past the threshold, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He wasn't looking around, wasn't pretending to be confused about closing time. He was looking straight at me. I didn't move. I don't even think I breathed. My brain was scrambling to make sense of it. Had I forgotten to lock the door? No, I was sure I had. But there he was, standing inside, completely still, like he was waiting for me to do something. My first instinct was to act normal, like maybe he was just confused. Maybe he didn't realize we were closed. So I forced my voice to come out steady. "Sorry, we're closed," I said, my hand gripping the edge of the counter. I must have forgotten to flip the sign. He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. Just stood there, head slightly tilted, his expression unreadable. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. The store was dead silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerators. I had my phone in the back, but I didn't want to take my eyes off him long enough to go get it. My only options were to wait and see what he'd do, or try to leave. But that meant getting past him. Then, without a word, he took a step forward. Just one. Deliberate. Slow. That's when I finally noticed what was off about him. His clothes were wrong. Not dirty, not messy, just outdated. His jeans were too stiff, like they'd never been worn before. His jacket was one of those generic windbreakers you'd find in a thrift store, brand new but weirdly old-fashioned. And his shoes, completely clean, like he hadn't been walking outside at all. It was such a small thing, but it sent a wave of cold terror through me. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey man, we're closed. You need to leave." Nothing. He just kept staring. His eyes were dark, unreadable, locked onto mine like he was studying me. My skin crawled. I took a careful step back, my mind racing. The emergency exit in the back was an option, but I'd have to get past the storage racks, and I had no idea if he'd follow. My best bet was getting to my phone in the back room. Then he moved again. Another step. And this time his lips curled slightly, just enough to form a hint of a smile. My stomach turned. There was nothing friendly about it. It wasn't the kind of smile people give when they're embarrassed or trying to explain themselves. It was intentional, like he knew exactly what he was doing. That's when I saw it. His hand slowly reaching into his jacket pocket. My body reacted before my brain did. I spun and bolted toward the back, my shoes skidding against the freshly mopped floor. I nearly slammed into the counter as I grabbed for the door handle, my fingers fumbling to push it open. My phone was on the back shelf, and my only thought was dialing 911 Before I could reach my phone, I heard the sound of something hitting the floor. Something small and metallic. My stomach clenched as I turned just enough to see him standing by the counter, his hand now empty. Whatever he had pulled from his pocket, he had dropped it. A key? A coin? I couldn't tell, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. The call barely rang once before I heard it. A sound that froze me mid-step. The soft click of the front door locking. He had locked us in. Panic surged through me. I backed up against the wall, pressing the phone to my ear, my voice breaking as I whispered, "There's someone in the store. He locked the door. Please, I need help." The operator started to respond, but then, silence. Not from her. From him. I couldn't see him anymore. He had vanished from my line of sight. My pulse pounded in my ears. I took a cautious step forward, peering around the storage room door. The cafe was empty. The man was gone. I didn't trust it. I stayed frozen, gripping my phone like a lifeline, my breath shallow. There was no way he had just left. Not after locking the door. Not after staring me down like that. My mind raced through possibilities. Was he hiding? Had he slipped into the restroom? Was he waiting for me to come out? The dispatcher's voice pulled me back. "Officers are on their way. Are you somewhere safe?" I wanted to say yes, but I wasn't sure. My best bet was getting out before he could corner me. The emergency exit in the back led straight to the parking lot. My car was right outside. Heart hammering, I moved fast, keeping my footsteps light. I pushed open the back door, wincing at the loud creak, and ran straight for my car. I didn't look back. Not even when I heard the distant sound of sirens approaching. I fumbled with my keys, threw myself into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. Only then did I turn to look at the cafe. Through the large front window, I could see inside. The lights cast long shadows across the floor. The door was still locked. The place was empty. But just as the cops pulled up, I saw it. Something small, glinting on the floor near the counter. The thing he had dropped. A single silver key. One that looked exactly like the one I used to lock the store every night. I never figured out how he got in. The police searched the building and found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no hiding spots, no explanation. I quit my job a week later. I still don't know what he wanted, or why he just stood there watching me. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see his face again. That slight, knowing smile. Like he had been testing something. Like next time, he wouldn't leave empty-handed.